Okay, so for this assignment, I chose a children's book about the Holocaust. I couldn't find a smaller book about the Holocaust, so I picked a chapter book. So in this video, I'm going to be reading the prologue and the first chapter, so that I'm not reading the whole entire book. So for this, I am reading the Four Perfect Pebbles, a Holocaust story by Lila Pearl and Maran Lamethel Lazon. So in this book, there is some German and some Dutch words that I may not pronounce correctly. So if I do not pronounce them correctly, I am sorry. So let's get started. So, prologue. This is a story of a family, a mother and father and their two young children, who became trapped in Hitler's Germany. They managed eventually to leave that country for Holland, where they were soon again caught in the Nazis' web, and their situation grew even more serious. For in the final years of World War II, when the Holocaust reached its most feverish pitch, the four members of the Blumenthal family were returned to Germany. During their ordeal lasting 6.5 years, the Blumenthals lived in refugees, transit, and prison camps that included Westerbork in Holland and the notorious concentration camp of Bergen-Belsen in Germany. Bergen-Belsen was the camp to which Anne Frank and her sister Margaret were transported in October 1944. The two girls, aged 15 and 19, died of typhus in March 1945. It was in the very same section of Bergen-Belsen that the Blumenthal family remained in prison from February 1944 to April 1945. Margot Blumenthal, the younger of the two children, was 9 years old when she arrived there. Her brother, Albert, was 11. The British troops who liberated Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945, wrote of its indescribable horrors. Piles of corpses lay unburied everywhere, while those who still breathed were little more than living skeletons. The entire camp population was infested with lice. Those prisoners who had not already succumbed were the dying victims of the typhus and other epidemic diseases, starvation, exposure, and neglect. The Blumenthals, however, were not among the deeply suffering prisoners who might have benefited from the British capture of Bergen-Belsen on April 15th. 6 days earlier, they had been marched to the camp's loading platform and placed aboard a train of cattle cars headed east in the direction of the dreaded Auschwitz extermination camp. For 2 weeks, the death train, so named for many passengers who died of typhus, made its tortuous way across Nazi Germany. When liberation came at last, it was at the hands of Russian troops who had little to offer those who staggered weakly from the train. As a grown woman, Margot Blumenthal Lazon recalls the events that shaped her youth. She tells of the 4 years she spent with her family in Holland's Westerbork, of her terrified arrival in Bergen-Belsen, and what it was like to live through the long chain of days behind its barbed wire fences, and of the struggles of her teenage years in post-war Europe and America. Invaluable details and documentation have also been supplied by her mother, Ruth Blumendal Mayberg, and her brother Albert Blumenthal. The inner strength and enduring spirit of the members of this family make it possible for all of us to become witnesses to an evil that sadly must remain forever in human memory. Alright, so that was the prelogue. So now, chapter 1 is called 4 Perfect Pebbles. Long before dawn crept through the windows of the wooden barracks, Moran stirred in Mama's arms. She had slept this way, wrapped in her mother's warmth, for many weeks now, ever since her family had arrived at the concentration camp of Bergen-Belsen in northwestern Germany. All around her were the sounds of the other women and children lying in the 3-decker bunks that ran the length of the barracks. As Moran came awake, the muffled noises sharpened. There were gasps and moans, rattling coughs, and short, piercing cries. And there was the ever-present stench of unwashed bodies, disease, and death. Hardly a morning passed without some of the prisoners no longer able to rise from their thin straw mattresses. When the guards came to round up the women and children for roll call, they stopped briefly to examine the unmoving forms. Later, those who had died in the night would be tumbled from their bunks onto a crude stretcher, and their bodies taken away to be burned or buried in mass graves. Soon new prisoners would arrive to take their places. As many as 600 would be crowded into barracks meant to hold 100. Mama nudged Moran. "Get up, Liebling, it's time." As soon as Mama withdrew her arms, thin as they had become, the warmth vanished and the chill of the unheated room gripped Moran's 9-year-old body. Cold and hunger. In her first weeks at Bergen-Belsen, Moran had been unable to decide which was worse. Soon, however, the constant gnawing sensation in her belly began to vanish. Her stomach accustomed itself to the daily ration of a chunk of black bread and a cup of watery turnip soup, and its capacity shrank. But the bitter chill of the long German winter went on and on. On one of her earliest days in the camp, Moran had actually believed that she saw a wagon load of firewood approaching. Perhaps it would stop in front of the barracks and some logs would be fed into the empty stove that was supposed to heat the entire room for hours of glorious warmth. But she had been horribly mistaken. The wagon trundled past, and closer look told her that it was filled not with firewood, but with the naked, stick-like bodies of dead prisoners. As on all winter mornings, getting dressed in the pre-dawn grayness took no time at all. Moran had slept in just about everything she owned. All she had to do was to put her arms through the sleeves of tattered coats that she had used as extra covering under the coarse, thin blanket the camp provided. Soon the cries of the capos, or police aides, privileged prisoners who served as guards, were heard as they moved from barracks to barracks. Some Apal, Ross, Juden. Moran and Mama must now find a way to relieve themselves before hurrying to the large square with its watchtower and armed guards where the daily appall or roll call took place. There was not always time to visit the communal outhouse about a block away from the barrack. The toilets in the outhouse were simply a long wooden bench with holes in it, suspended over a trench. There was no water to flush away the waste, no paper or no toilet paper, and of course, no privacy. Some mornings, Moran and Mama and the other prisoners had to use whatever receptacle they owned as night buckets, even the very mugs or bowls in which they received their daily rations. Before leaving the barracks for Appal, the prisoners had to make sure the room was clean, the floor swept, and their beds made. Each inmate stood in front of her bunk for inspection. If the blankets were not tucked neatly enough around the sagging straw mattresses, punishment were meted out. The slightest infraction could mean losing one's bread ration for the day. Roll call was held twice a day at 6 in the morning and again after the prisoners had returned from their work assignments. It was held in winter and summer, in ice and snow, in rain and mud. If a single person was missing because of sickness, death, or an attempted escape, all the prisoners were made to stand at attention in rows of 5 for hours, even for a whole day, without food or water or any to relieve themselves. Some prisoners did not try to escape, or did try to escape, but very few succeeded. Each section of the camp was surrounded by a high fence of barbed wire. The fence was charged with electricity and had pictures of death's heads posted on it as a warning. Prisoners who attempted to scale the fence were electrocuted. Others who tried to escape while on a work detail outside the fenced area were almost always caught by the watchful eyes of the armed guards, by keen-nosed police dogs, or at night by sweeping searchlights. Moran hoped, as she did every morning, that the roll call in the square would be over as quickly as possible. Then, after dismissal, there might be a few moments to see Papa and her 11-year-old brother, Albert, who were imprisoned in separate barracks in the men's section. In Westerbork, the Dutch camp where the family had lived before, all 4 of them had been housed in crude but private quarters. However, no such arrangement existed for any of the prisoners in Bergen-Belsen. Actually, they were told that they should consider themselves lucky to be in the section of the camp known as Sternlager, or Star Camp. Here, male and female prisoners were allowed to meet briefly during the day. Also, they could dress in their own clothes instead of striped prison uniforms. But of course, they must wear the yellow Star of David high up on their left side of their chest, as they had been forced to do many years now. In the center of the 6-pointed star, the word Jude, which means Jew in German, was inscripted in black. Today, possibly because of the icy temperature, the barracks guards had begun reporting their head counts quickly. There were 2 prisoners missing, but they had already been found. They had run into the wires, sometimes during the night. This was the term the Kopos used to describe the act of committing suicide when prisoners died by hurling themselves against electrified barbed wire fence. In just under 1 hour, the roll call had been completed. Already Moran and Mama had spotted Albert and Papa across the frozen ground of the square. Now the entire family came together in a hasty, wordless embrace, for there was never much time. At once Papa began to push into Mama's hands the extra rations he had managed to trade for cigarettes. In the weeks since the family had come to Bergen-Belsen, the male prisoners in Sternlager had been receiving a small number of cigarettes once every few days. Papa, who did not smoke, immediately went about exchanging his cigarettes with other prisoners for a bit of food, such as small chunks of bread, a turnip, or even a potato. Mama, after making sure that Papa had kept enough for himself and Albert, squirreled these items away for herself and Moran. Albert, too, usually had a small hoard of secret treasures. He carefully collected the tobacco from partially smoking cigarette butts and made his own trades to get extra rations. Moran had brought along her own secret treasure this morning, but hers was not anything to eat. She felt in her coat pocket to make sure the 3 pebbles were still there. Then she carefully drew them out and opened her palm for Albert to see. Albert, who seemed to be growing taller and more skeletal every day, looked down at Moran's hand. "Yes, I see," he said with a wan smile. "That again?" "That again," Moran mimicked him. Her deep-set eyes grew fiery. Look closely. I have these 3 pebbles exactly matching. Today I will find the 4th. I suppose you think I'm silly." "No, no," Albert calmed her. He had always been the soothing, protective child. Moran was the excitable one. 4 perfect pebbles," Moran said proudly, watching her own breath from a mist in the frosty air. "1 for each of us. You'll see. I'll show you the 4th one tomorrow." Albert placed a hand on her shoulder. "Yes, of course." Moran flashed him a look, part love, part impatience. Big brothers were all the same. Time and again, Albert told her that there could be no such thing as even 2 perfectly matching pebbles. Pebbles were like the snowflakes. Every single one was different from each other. But Moran ignored such scientific reasoning. So she had a fixed idea, one that was important for her to hold on to. If she could find 4 pebbles almost exactly the same shape and size, it meant that her family would remain whole. Mama and Papa and she and Albert would survive Bergen-Belsen. The 4 of them might even survive the Nazis' attempt to destroy every last Jew in Europe. Over and over, Moran had collected such pebbles in groups of 4, terrifying herself when she could find only 2 or 3 and not a 4th that matched. A foolish pastime. A superstition? Perhaps. But the set of pebbles were her lucky charm, and they gave her a purpose. Searching for a complete set was always a way to fill the succession of empty days. Each day at Bergen-Belsen was the same, with nothing to do but stand at roll call and worry about when Mama would reappear from her work detail. In Westerberg, where they had lived for the past 4 years, some of the camp inmates taught informal classes, but here was no schooling or even any work for a child of 9. There was only Moran's self-invented game. It was her own way of keeping her family together. It was also a way of linking a past she could vaguely remember with a future that she could hardly imagine. How had Moran's family become caught in the Nazis' trap? Why had Papa's carefully thought-out plans to escape from Germany failed, when in fact had all of their troubles started? Moran was too young to remember having lived at the beginning of the story, but Mama remembered. She knew it all, and she would tell it to Moran as they lay whispering in their bunk at night. As Mama told it, their family story sounded like a fairy tale that grew more and more frightening as it went on. Its ending had not been written yet, but it did have a fairly happy beginning. "Of course you don't remember," Mama would sigh as she drew the covers more tightly around them. "When you were just a baby in that small town in Germany." Alright, that's chapter 1 of this book. So, hope you enjoyed.